Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Big cities have rats. At least most big cities do, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, the largest city in Canada has the country's biggest rat problem, and it's getting worse. The nation's capital, even though it is much smaller, is also scrambling for ways to try to contain a spike in the rodent population. Here's the thing, though. This isn't new. Even before the pandemic, Toronto was struggling with explosive rat growth. It was so bad, the critters were reported to be, quote, taking over the city. And at the time, the city's plan was to study it. So now, 5 years later, the rats are seemingly everywhere because clearly the city has procrastinated. I'm sorry. I had to. Don't hate me. Seriously, though, in Toronto, 5 years later, this is where we're at.
Here in Toronto, the council will vote later this month to ask the city to come up with an action plan to reduce the number of rodents.
Meanwhile, in Ottawa, the city is wading into experimental methods of rat control in the hopes that something, anything, might work. And then there's Alberta. Alberta claims to have been rat-free for 70 years now. Today, they stamp out any infestation as soon as it appears. Some Albertans don't even know what a rat looks like. How does that happen? Why is one province rat-free and another almost completely overwhelmed? Will what Alberta did work in Toronto or Ottawa? And if not, will anything? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Sheila Reid is a reporter with the Canadian Press based in Toronto. One city out of many, Sheila, that is struggling with rats right now.
Yeah, that's correct. There's a lot of rat talk going on in the city right now, both anecdotal and then actual reports of maybe what we're going to do about that problem.
Well, this is great. We're so happy to talk to you because 5 years ago, we talked with Amy Dempsey of the Toronto Star, who had just at the time written a feature about how rats were taking over Toronto and how the city was going to study it in the hopes of eventually figuring out a plan and putting it into action. So I guess the first thing I'll ask you before we get to why they're taking over is, did that study ever go into action? What's the city doing about rats?
So currently the city's action plan is one basically of education and personal responsibility. So really basic things like keeping your trash tidy and your food waste locked, maintaining your lawn, sealing cracks in and around your house where rats would be able to get in. But there's no real sort of coordinated city action plan, unfortunately. And so this latest motion by two Toronto city councillors was basically to make a plan to make a plan. And that's something that's going to come to council later this month for a vote. But unfortunately, I don't think much has really moved in terms of sort of a citywide coordinated rat prevention program.
And Toronto's not the only city struggling with rats right now, as I mentioned off the top. You wrote about Ottawa. Obviously, there are cities in the U.S. Do we know what's driving what seems to be a pretty massive increase over the past 5 or so years in the rat populations in some major cities?
So one of the big driving forces, I think, in terms of the visibility of rats, which kind of adds to a perceived increase in rats in the city, is that we are seeing rats who are coming out from underground as a result of all the construction that's going on right now in Toronto. There's a lot of new buildings, residential and commercial, being built at the moment, and a lot of transit intensification. And in order to do that kind of work, they do drill underground, and it disrupts a lot of the rat habitat. So we're definitely seeing rats kind of driven out of maybe places where they had been camping out for a while. Another mitigating factor that some are saying is that climate change is also prolonging the warmer seasons when rats tend to breed. So it's a problem of both visibility and potentially a population boom in the rats due to kind of climate change. Now, I haven't seen any studies on that. I have asked the city for such studies, and they haven't been able to provide anything yet. But I think the thing with when we say things like the city's being overrun with rats, I think that's really maybe like people's particular thresholds in terms of, how much rat they can really take.
Right.
Because, I think a lot of people in this city have probably seen rats in the subways, or maybe you see a rat at night kind of hanging around some trash. But seeing a rat in your home is much different. And I think people have a very low threshold for that kind of rat visibility.
That's so interesting. So we don't really know if this is a hard number increase or if this is just rats are in different places at different times. So we freak out about it a little bit.
Exactly. And that's not to invalidate people who feel like they're being overrun or the problem is really exacerbated, because there are definitely, I think, a lot of small businesses in certain areas that maybe have noticed an increase. And that's something that's difficult to report on because most, restaurants or places that have food don't really want to admit to having rat problems.
Right.
But for, different constituents, particularly the person I spoke with was Alejandra Bravo, whose ward is Davenport, where a lot of construction is going on. And she's heard from a lot of residents over the past couple of years who are really kind of fed up with the situation.
And so while Toronto is making a plan to make a plan, as you put it, you wrote about Ottawa, which is confronting its own rat problem in a slightly different way. Can you walk us through what that city's doing right now?
Yeah. So again, it's sort of a plan to explore a plan. And that plan is rat birth control. So there's a form of rat contraception that is not yet legal in Canada, but has been deployed in a few American cities. It's being used in Seattle right now. There was a trial that happened in Washington, D.C., and New York City is also exploring the option. And there are a couple different name brands for that particular drug. So basically, an Ottawa City councillor by the name of Lane Johnson wrote to Health Canada to see if we could expedite the review of that product. And I think that there are a lot of questions potentially around that option. Some cities have reported that it's been successful, but in Washington, D.C., they actually discontinued using it because they found the results were maybe a little inconclusive.
This is maybe a silly question on my part, but presumably if you can give the rats birth control, you could also just give them rat poison, right? So why would they go this route?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there are a lot of factors around rat poison that maybe make people a little bit squeamish. And there are various issues, even like with private exterminators. Some of them won't use rat poison because the rats will eat it, crawl away and die, and then it causes a smell. But the way that rat poison is usually deployed is like in areas where rats would be. So like outside of your home, perhaps sewers, places like that. But one big issue with poison is that you can't really control which animals eat it. So that becomes kind of a bit of an ecological problem when other animals that you're not intending to kill eat it. And there was a very famous incident recently in New York City. One of the Central Zoo owls actually crashed into a building and was found to have rodenticide in its system after, doing a post-mortem. And so this kind of was maybe a call to arms to find a different solution beyond poison, which is why New York City is also kind of exploring the option of rat birth control. But there are some issues, with that option, because obviously the rats would have to keep going back to the birth control in order for it to continue to work.
They got to remember to take the pill.
Exactly. And so that's a huge amount of personal responsibility on the rats to maintain their own reproductive health. Another thing about rat poison is that rats can actually learn. So if they eat something that makes them feel sick or that the other rats are dying from, they're not going to go back to that food source. And in places like Toronto or New York City or any kind of densely populated area where there's going to be a lot of food sources, they don't really need to go back to the rat poison. So supposedly this form of birth control for rats is something that is really tasty to them and that hopefully they keep going back to.
While you were talking to Ontario cities about how to confront this growing problem, you also reached out to Alberta. And for those who aren't familiar with Alberta and rats, why Alberta?
So Alberta has boasted being a rat-free zone for just about 70 years now. Back in the 50s, they began kind of this grand project of eliminating all of the rats in the entire province. And It was a huge coordinated effort, and they basically did this by using mass quantities of arsenic tracking powder. So it was a process of total elimination. They were not exploring any sort of humane option. And there's actually kind of a lot of like interesting propaganda posters that almost look like sort of Red Scare anti-communist posters that would have been around at that time, sort of urging people to kill rats or report rat sightings. And it was just, they've adopted this zero tolerance policy. And unless you're, a huge fan of rats, it's been a great success in the province.
When they say that Alberta is rat-free, what does that actually mean? Is it literal? Because surely rats must be spotted from time to time.
So there is like a sort of a hotline that you can contact when you do see a rat. And at this point, they have the situation so under control that kind of the province responds to these like single rat sightings. And there's a huge coordination, I think, on the part of different municipalities in the area. But Karen Wickerson, also known as the Rat Lady in Alberta, is the rat and pest specialist for the entire province. And she'll field some of those calls herself. And they are so unaccustomed to rats that they're not even sure what they look like anymore. So Karen actually told me that they'll often get people sending photos in of muskrats or sometimes even tree squirrels, which is something that I think people in Toronto are very unfamiliar with because we know very well what a rat looks like. And yeah, like I said, because it's been, relatively rat-free, they still do get about 400 to 500 alleged sightings. I think they said about half of those are actually rats, but they're able to contain it much better just because of the culture around keeping the province rat-free there.
And I'm not trying to be cute about this or anything, but like when those calls come in, there's like a rat squad that rolls out in a car and like chases them down and exterminates them with no mercy.
I'm not sure what the squad actually looks like.
I'm kind of picturing Ghostbusters, if I'm being super honest.
Yeah, they're uniformed. But you know what? You don't have to go that far back in history to kind of even find news stories about Albertans, just like regular citizens, vigilantes, maybe you might say, kind of just like clobbering rats.
Right.
Because, the education around it has been very effective, that they just don't tolerate them. And so they're killed on sight. But if you do call someone about a rat incident, someone will be deployed to your property or wherever. Now, in the case of like different factory, sometimes there are rats that show up in the province. Karen Wickerson often would say that that's the result of them hitching a ride on trucks or maybe in someone's car. But they're still able to contain it pretty well. And I think when it comes to like transport trucks or stuff like that, there's like more of an inspection process. So they're just like better equipped, I think, at this point to handle when there is some kind of infestation.
And what does Wilkerson, who I am generously not going to call the Rat Lady, think of the more humane approaches like what Ottawa and others are looking at doing?
So my conversation with Karen, I think she seems skeptical, mostly because it's something that they would have to keep eating in order for it to be effective. And she kind of cited a multi-pronged approach that they adhere to in Alberta, but I also think that mostly that approach is just killing them. I don't think that they handle it in any other way, and I've not been able to find anyone who says that they handle it in any other way. And it's also easier for them to do so because the rat population is so low and contained. And they also really benefit from a lot of like natural environmental factors. So, to the north, it's quite cold and harsh. And to the south, it's not very inhabited. And then to the west, you have the Rocky Mountains. And to the east, they've been able to coordinate with the province of Saskatchewan to create a bit of a rat exclusion zone, which we don't really benefit from here in Toronto, because this is, kind of a very densely populated area in southern Ontario. There's a lot of interconnectivity, a lot of people who commute to and from anywhere from like Windsor all the way to Montreal. It's a hugely trafficked area. So there would have to be a ton of municipal coordination in order for us to kind of reach the status of that Alberta has reached. But, it's something that people are definitely exploring and talking about.
Does Wilkerson think that that approach from Alberta could work in Ontario, given, the factors you just discussed, but also the fact that, like, the rat's out of the bag, there's millions of them. And I can't even imagine at this point what an extinction level approach to rats in this province would look like.
Yeah, it seems like it would maybe take some stronger stomachs, but she wouldn't say for sure how it could be dealt with in urban areas, which is something that I did ask her. But I think that it's also a unique situation here. We have so many large metropolises between Toronto, Ottawa, Mississauga, Hamilton, versus Alberta has kind of two major cities that have a lot of distance between them. So it's just a lot different here. And I think if we kind of look at other cities, North American cities like, say, New York and Chicago, that are larger or comparable to the city of Toronto, that might be a more realistic kind of measuring stick.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, New York has been dealing with rats for a very long time. New York City rats are kind of like an infamous character unto themselves. And New York has its own unique problems. I mean, they've only kind of just started to actually can their garbage. It used to just kind of be out kind of in the open in garbage bags. So they're kind of taking some very rudimentary steps in our eyes to help solve their rat problem. So we're further ahead than them. But I think it's also important to see, this is what can happen if you don't sort of implement something almost immediately. So we have a lot of kind of different examples. We're somewhere between Alberta and New York City, I think would be fair to say.
And in the meantime, then, as we make plans to make plans or try out experimental ideas, what should ordinary citizens be doing when they see rats? You mentioned personal responsibility is a lot of this. And should we just, I'm not saying learn to live with it, but sort of rewire how we feel when we see them, maybe during the day or in a place that might be unfamiliar to us, assuming that that's not our house, because everybody gets licensed to freak out when it's our home.
Yeah. So I think a lot of that has to do with how we deal with rat food sources. So, I know it sounds trite, but keeping your trash tidy is kind of important, making sure that there's not food lying around because rats will absolutely eat that. I think in Toronto, we're mostly used to dealing with raccoons. And that's kind of been a major source of kind of some kind of collective thought in terms of keeping your trash tidy and your food stored and stuff like that. But I think it's maybe just something that is going to take something a little more than what people do on a day-to-day basis in their own kind of little areas. Something that was being explored in Peel region was a subsidy for residents to cover half the cost of exterminators to come. And I did speak with someone from the region who said that wasn't actually used very much. So I think that people maybe don't really feel responsible for the rats around their house, but the rats around your house at some point could become the rats inside your house. So I don't know if we need some sort of grand propaganda campaign like Alberta did, but it seemed to work very well for them. And I think that this is kind of an issue that is very unique in that if someone else has a rat, that could become your problem eventually. So whether that's something we all kind of need to join forces on or, if the city kind of really take the helm, it's not for me to say. I'm not a zoologist and I don't know the best way to deal with the rat problem. But I'm curious to see what City Council comes up with in the future.
Well, maybe 5 years from now,
yes,
we will have that plan that they're making. Thank you so much for this, Sheila. This is a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Sheila Reid reporting for the Canadian Press. That was the big story. If you want to listen to an episode from 5 years ago about Toronto's rat problem, you can do it. We'll even link to that episode in the show notes. You will be, I was going to say surprised, but you actually won't be surprised, but perhaps incensed by what the city was planning to do half a decade ago and where it is today. You can, of course, find all of our other episodes at thebigstorypodcast.ca, and you can send us feedback by calling 416-935-5935 and leaving a voicemail, or by shooting us an email. The address is hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. We're available in all your favorite podcast players and your favorite smart speaker. Just ask it to play The Big Story Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.